All right. Good evening, guys. I am very sorry for the late upload. I'm still a little off schedule with the Christmas season being here and celebrating with family and friends. So I'm working to get back on track to my morning uploads. But thanks for tuning in. Today is the day that we discuss church things. And over the last few videos, I have been talking about reasons why I think you should go to church. And we've looked at some scripture passages. We've looked at some interesting studies and data. And then I've also tried to address a few objections that I think people give, some more legitimate, some not. Really, there's not anything legitimate because you should be going to church. And that's why we're discussing right now. Because now, and I shared a little bit of my own church background, kind of where I'm coming from, in my own experience and kind of where I stand now theologically. I'm sure we'll get into more detail as the videos go on, but today I want to begin an overview of the actual process. So we're going to start getting into a little bit more practical discussion here. I want to help. I don't just want to sit here and talk about what I went through. I want to help you find a good church, and I hope that this is something that's useful to you guys. By no means is this like a, tried and true method. Everybody doesn't have to do this, but this is just the process, the general process I would recommend based on my very recent experience of having to find a new church. We're coming up on this Easter. It will be 1 full year that we have been attending what is now our church home. We have since become members already. We've gone through an adult catechism class, and we are now communing members of the church, my wife and I, and my son. So I want that for you guys too. I want to help you guys get involved in a local church where you can grow and be taught and serve and help exercise the gifts. And I've got a 10-step program, but some of these steps are to be done conditionally or kind of throughout the whole process. You'll see here in a second. I'm just going to kind of do an overview of it for now. We're going to go through without going into a whole lot of detail. And then in the videos to come, we're going to break each of these down a little bit more. Some will need a little bit more time. Some we may even skip over altogether. And you'll see why. So without further ado, let's get into it. So step number 1 is determine. Do you need to search for a new church? All these steps I'm also going to include in the description, at least their shorthand version. I would like to eventually make this a document available to anyone, as well as the other things that I reference in my videos. I don't know how I'm going to do that yet. I am still very much learning how to function on the internet. But step 1. Basically, this is where you're determining whether or not you do need to search for a church, because this is something that should never be taken lightly. I want to stress what we need to avoid here is church hopping or denomination hopping or whatever. It is not a good thing for you to be just hopping from one congregation to the next at the drop of a hat. It's one thing to go into a season of this where you are visiting different churches to try to find the right place. But once you have found that place, whether it's where you're at now or where you are going to find soon, you need to commit and you need to stay there. And there are certain circumstances, I think, that can justify leaving your congregation. But generally, part of honoring our father and our mother, or those rightful earthly authorities over us, is by committing to that congregation. It's especially once a lot of time has gone by and you've begun to establish and build relationships with people. It's a little jarring to just move on. So you don't want to do this. You don't want to begin this undertaking for anything trivial. Feeling convicted because your pastor has addressed a sin you need to repent of is not a legitimate reason to leave that church. But some legitimate reasons, and really the biggest one that we're going to focus on with this whole process, is a significant entering a time where you are experiencing a significant shift in your convictions on high-level church doctrines. We'll get into what that means here in just a second. But this doesn't mean like, oh, I used to be, a premillennial guy, now I'm post-millennial guy. That doesn't justify leaving your church. I don't care if everyone in there is a dispy. You need to stay right where you're at. That in and of itself is not a good reason to leave. But there are some doctrines that if you start to really... So with my personal experience, we'll come back to that next step. Another couple reasons: legitimate abuse. So sad to say, humans are humans, and some congregations are better than others, which means some are really bad. And I actually have had people close to me that have gone through this where there was actually the pastor's family was engaging in some bullying, of all things. Bullying. I need to enunciate my words. Of these people that I know, and it got so bad that they left. They tried to visit with the pastor more than once and address it with them, and it just got so bad they had to go find somewhere else. And that is really sad, especially from the leadership, but that church was very cliquey, and if you weren't in the in-group, then you were kind of a second-class citizen within your own church, and that's just not a good place to be. And sometimes significant logistical burdens can give you a good reason why you might begin your search. But the overwhelming amount of time I want to spend on it, in really what most people are going to go through this process for, is for those big conviction changes. So if you are not part of if you're part of a church already, I would recommend, while you are coming to this decision, you need to keep attending your church. Don't just stop attending your church because you are having some second thoughts about some things. You need to keep going until you know for a fact that it's time to move on to somewhere else. If you are not part of a church, congratulations. The automatic answer is yes. So step 2 is familiarize, is a big thing that I want to talk about. I want to spend a lot of time talking about in future videos. I want to introduce you to a term that I'm going to reintroduce this to you because I know I've already brought it up before, and that is theological triage. So that is identifying doctrines in the faith and putting them into categories. So you got tier 1, 2, and 3. Usually 3 groups is what you see. I like 4 because tier 1 is going to be your essential tier. That's where things like that affect the gospel. You cannot make changes to tier 1 and continue to call yourself a Christian. So, but most of our time and energy is going to be spent in tier 2, which is what I call your critical doctrines. So these are things that don't determine whether or not you're a Christian, but they are going to understandably distinguish one church tradition from another. So that's going to include things like your sacraments, whether or not they ordain women, and your church politics, like how your church is organized. Not how the power play goes on in your individual church, but, do you prefer a hierarchical system, something like the Catholic Church, where you have multiple ranks of bishops and rigid hierarchy, or are you more congregational, like how Baptists tend to be? Or are you something in between? Because there's a couple systems that are kind of a mix of that. Tier 3 I call significant, and tier 4 I call insignificant. So these are definitely more of what you're going to call your secondary issues or your tertiary issues. I would, a lot of this is subjective. I think most people would agree on the critical stuff. Tier 3 is going to be, and 4 are going to be more subjective. I think eschatology is a good example of something for tier 3, because you can disagree on the finer details of eschatology with somebody else in your congregation and still go to the same church and still be on good terms and have wonderful conversations with that person and edify one another. But if I believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist and you are a memorialist, we're not going to get along very well. And it's going to be very hard for us to function in that church together. Not that we're not going to get along very well, but it is going to be very hard for us to participate in that sacrament together. And we really shouldn't if we have that big a difference in conviction on that particular. And that's why that communion, your sacraments, are tier 2, and your eschatology is tier 3. But these are still important. So if you get enough of these that are your concerns, I can understand why it might start to sway you a little bit. Or these might even help you decide between Say you get it down to your final two, and this church has something, you kind of like their theological words are hard. You like their end times views a little better than this church over here, but they're still both, Baptist, let's say. This one's a non-millennialist, this one's a premillennial, so you decide you want to go with this one. I think that's understandable when Tier 3 might come into play. Tier 4 is everything else that doesn't really matter. It's not to say it doesn't matter, but it by no means should divide Christians. This is your whole, how many angels are there? Do dogs go to heaven? Stuff that can kind of border on silly, but some people might care about, or it might just be fun to discuss, but should not separate you from your Christian brother. We should strive for as little division as possible. We'll get a lot more into step 2. Sorry, these are pretty front heavy here. We'll get a lot more into step 2 in the future. Step 3 is you need to study. So you are going to really start to dig into what it is that's most important to you. So step 2, you've kind of familiarized yourself with theological triage. Step 3 is now you're going to pick what are those doctrines that are the most important to you. And by the way, theological triage is not something I came up with. I was introduced to it by Redeemed Zoomer, and more so than him, I was introduced to it by Dr. Gavin Ortland, who talks about it at length in one of his books. I believe it's How to Be a Protestant, but it may have been, or not How to Be. One of his books, I have one of them in my Amazon library. He talks a lot about this, kind of breaks it down. I've lost my train of thought. Talking about important doctrines, so man, that was rough. I just I'm going back and forth between the camera and myself. I'm trying to get used to looking directly at the camera, so I'm talking to you and not sitting here making sure my hair looks good, anyways. So step 3 is study. You're going to really get familiar with that tier 2, especially here. And you're going to use that at minimum to start to learn what the basic... First of all, you need to learn what the basic Christian traditions are. You need to know what a Methodist is. You need to know what a Lutheran is. You need to know what a Baptist is. You need to know what an Anglican is. If you are considering shifting to a new tradition. So you need to know what those are, and you need to know at least the SparkNotes version of their theology, particularly in that tier 2 range. You need to know what their sacraments are. Does the churches you're looking at, do they ordain women? How are they organized? Is that going to affect you? And so on. Number 4 is when you're going to start to make your list. So tier 1 comes into play here because you're going to... If it's a church that disagrees with a tier 1 doctrine, you're not even going to put that on your list. So sorry, LDS. Sorry, Jehovah's Witnesses. These were churches I didn't even consider because, quite frankly, they're not Christian. And we can talk about that another day, why that is the case. But that's not even going to make your list. Tier 2, you're going to, and this is your big list. So you need to look at what's available around you. So I, for example, did not consider the Anglican tradition because there's a very weak presence where I live. There's maybe one Episcopalian church, 1 or 2, and there's one ACNA church. And that one is barely established. They looked like they were just getting started. So I stayed away from them, and it mostly came down to a decision of whether I wanted to go Reformed of some variety or Lutheran. And I ended up going Lutheran. Excuse me. But look at what's available around you. Start to kind of make a list. And it's okay. You can make it as long as you want. Some go back through, cross couples off. This is just to get you started. And it's okay to have a variety. You're going to want to make sure you have some that are closer, that are a little closer to your convictions. But it's okay to have a little variety. And yes, we can even include attending perhaps a Catholic church or an Orthodox church, because I want to make it very clear to you guys, my goal here, I may be Lutheran, and I'm gonna simp for Lutheranism in some different videos. And overall, I would love for you guys all to come join the LCMS. But more than that, I want you to be a Christian. That is of infinitely more importance, is that you are a Christian before you go to my specific church, as much as I would love to see you there. So if you want to try out, an Orthodox church or a Catholic church on that list somewhere, by all means, go ahead. If that's where your convictions are leading, all the best to you, brother. Step 5 is when you're going to begin your visits. So you're not going to spend a whole lot of time. At minimum, you need to be going to the service you would be most likely to attend if you begin regularly attending that church. So don't just go to this, Saturday evening service because you think it sounds cool when you're normally going to be going on Sunday. So you need to make sure you go to a Sunday. You're not going to spend a ton of time. Like, by all means, be generous, be genuine, take good notes. You don't necessarily have to do it during the service, but afterwards you need to make sure while it's fresh in your mind, get this stuff down on paper. Or I had documents I can also use an example one day when I figure out how to share this stuff with you guys. Make notes and have a template that you just go to every single time with every church you visit, because you're going to eventually compare them to one another. But this is kind of your more high-level view. You're just kind of getting a feel for the church. Maybe introduce yourself to the pastor or, the elders or whoever. Be friendly, but you're kind of just getting that initial feel, because some churches you may walk in and be like, wow, this is really cool. I want more. Others you're going to almost immediately know, nope, not for me. And there were certainly a couple churches that we went to. Nothing horrific, but just, it was a little overwhelming. And in addition to theology, so theology is going to be your primary thing you look at, but there are other things that matter. So other things as you make this list that you're going to need to, not necessarily when you're making the list, but when you're making your notes after your visits, you need to consider how far away from home is it. My wife and I go to a church that's a little further away than we would probably like, but the church is of such quality that we think it's worth it. That may not be the case for you. You may need a church within walking distance because that's going to keep you going consistently. Do they operate a school? Looking forward to having kids, or maybe you already have kids. How much is it to get your kids in that school? Or is it just kind of an automatic thing? Schools are going to be a big attraction for a lot of people. So that's something to consider. What ministries are they involved in? What do they run? Do they have a youth program? Do they have, an old folks program? What charities do they support or do they participate in? All that stuff. What classes do they offer? Because you need to learn while you're there and be under someone's instruction. Step number 6. So 5, 6. You're going to narrow down that list. So your first visit, you're going to go one to the other. How my wife and I started is on this first list, we would go to our church we were currently attending for one Sunday, and then the next Sunday we would go visit a new church, and then we would go back and forth and back and forth. Once you get to this shorter list, that's when we started more regularly attending. If that's too much for you, by all means, just attend the churches, and because the point is to get you to a final decision. We don't want you hanging out here in limbo forever. You don't need to be a church hopper for life. It took my wife and I about a year to get to that final decision point. I probably wouldn't push it a lot past that. So step number 6 is going to be to narrow down that list. So start looking at your notes, comparing them side by side. And you're going to want to go for, if you started with a list that's about 10 or longer, narrow it down to a top 5. If it's about 10 or under, narrow it down to a top 3, and then move on to step 7, which is to visit all those churches again that are on your short list now. If you narrowed it down to a top 5, you're going to get to kind of a repeat, rinse and repeat kind of here. So you revisit every church, make your notes, update your notes, but maybe you spend a little bit more time now. So now as you're getting to a shorter list, you're going to make sure you attend a Bible study or two. If the pastor or somebody else invites you out for coffee or for a meal, it's probably a good chance to ask some questions, start gather some more information. If you are on your top 5, go ahead and get 2 of those struck off your list and get that down to a top 3. And then from a top 3, you're going to go to step 8, which is your final 2. So you're coming to your final decision. another round of visits. And you don't necessarily have to do another round of visit every single step. My wife and I pretty quickly went from our top 5 down to the final 2. We didn't do like a top 3. We just kind of discussed, and that is another important thing. If you are married, this absolutely needs to be something that your wife is a part of, or if you're a young woman, this needs to be something that your husband is a part of, and really ideally should be leading, because if he's the leader of your home, this should be an effort that he is spearheading. But you need to make this decision together. My wife and I had to kind of discuss and come to certain agreements on what was actually a better choice for us that was beneficial for both of us. And that's not to put all the focus on ourselves, because ultimately, we're not the main characters of this whole story. That would be Christ. But you do need to get into a good church that is going to be a good fit for you. So step 8, you're on to your final 2. And then finally, you're going to make your decision. So at the end of step 8, you have made your decision. You have, through all this study and prayer. And that study step, by the way, way back in step 3 is going on this whole time. So as you're visiting these churches and make your notes and, comparing your notes, you need to continue to study and learn, because you may change your mind. You may have struck a church off that at first didn't sound right for you. I thought I was going to go Reformed. My final decision came down to a Reformed church and a Lutheran church. And ultimately, there were certain reasons that we went Lutheran when I, up until that point, had been, tipping towards Reformed. But now I am so glad that we went what we went with, and I wouldn't change it for the world. So step 9. So you've made your church, where you're going to go, or you've made your choice, where you're going to go to church. Step 9 and 10 is kind of the follow through. So you need to, if you're a part of a church already, or you were attending a church before this whole process began, this is where you need to make your respectful. Before this has started, you need to be upfront with whoever you're involved with, whether it's a small group or your pastor or whoever. I spoke with both my small group and my pastor. We sat down for lunch, and I let them know that I was doing this, that after coming back to the faith from a long time away, I was feeling some new convictions I never had before, and they were becoming stronger and stronger the more that I read my Bible and the more that I learned. And that's why we ultimately began this process. But you need to be upfront with that. You don't need to do the smoke and mirrors routine. This isn't about, it's going to feel awkward. It's going to feel kind of like you're breaking up with your girlfriend at times, but you need to be honest. We don't operate in the shadows. And be respectful. Don't be telling them like, you all suck with how you do communion. You need to be doing this, blah, 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 blah. Be respectful, man. There's no sense in, creating bad blood on your way out the door, because they are still more than likely your Christian brothers, unless you're leaving something like a Jehovah's Witness situation. And then finally, step 10, at your new church, you need to not just establish that habit of regular attendance, but you need to pursue membership. Most churches these days, membership's a thing. There's a difference between just attending a church and being a member. Most churches will have certain expectations, certain classes you got to go through. So become a member. You need to commit. This is part of that. Our relationship with our local church needs to approach the significance of our marriage relationship. That's how serious we need to take this, and almost no one in America today takes it that seriously, but that is absolutely how serious you need to take this thing. And then get involved. Start going to classes. Start looking for ways to get, volunteer, to serve your church, to get, out in the community doing things. Get involved. This needs to be what our life centers around, not just going to work to get your time off and you die one day. This needs to be, and is what used to center most communities. So, and it can be again. So, and give. I know people get wrapped around the axle about tithe, but your pastor needs a paycheck. This is what he does full time, most likely. So you do, once you've made this commitment, you ought to want to give to support your church because you believe in the things that they do. But yeah, so that's the 10 steps. I'm going to put them all down in the description or over to the side, wherever it's at for you. And we will dig into more detail. I know I've gone on. I keep saying I'm going to shorten these videos, and they always end up longer than I intend for them to be. But thank you for listening to me ramble. That is by no means a foolproof process. It's by no means a foolproof plan here, but I found that if you're a Protestant or an evangelical in the United States, it can be very challenging to find a church. So it helps to have someone kind of put some kind of thing down for you to get started, going down some track, moving in the right direction. And you know what? Take this and improve upon it. Let me know what ways you think I can make this better. I know I could definitely be more concise. So if you stuck with me this whole time, I really appreciate it. And I look forward to discussing more in depth about these things. And we'll take it one step at a time. I love you guys. God bless you. May the Lord bless you and keep you guys well, whatever it is that you are up to today. And we'll see you next time.